Okay. Having laid out Luke's life and biography last week, I hope you learned some things. I know I did. I mean, he was more than just Paul's assistant. He was, in his own right, an evangelist. He managed the mission team for Paul a good deal. Of course, he was a writer and a researcher, and he was a pastor for several years over in Philippi, the first European church. So he's a very interesting character. And so now we're going to begin the study of his gospel, which is the story of the life of Jesus. Now, following John and Len it's a hard thing to do. And I thought, well, what can I do different? All while they were teaching, Len would mention something in Luke, and I'd go to John and I'd go, can't do that. And then John would do something and also reference Luke, and I said, oh, you can't do that. And, so how are we going to go through this? I'd like to do it a little bit differently than you might be used to. I want to try to give you and get from myself a feeling of the movement of Jesus and his disciples around the Holy Land as they did what they did and said what they said, and the locations where they spent time and where they did certain things. Now, you're all familiar with a lot of stories in the gospel, the Good Samaritan parable. When was that given in his life? Well, we know it's in some of the gospels. I can never find them because I'm not sure about whether it's in Mark or in Matthew or in Luke and John or who covers it and where, and what's going on is not clear to me, because they each selected something to pass on to you. John himself, at the last verse of his book, says, if we were to record all the things that Jesus did, there wouldn't be enough books in the world. And so they definitely had to be selective. And so they did. And they didn't all select the same things. And so we need to find a way, if we're going to put Jesus' life in a chronological order and follow him and his disciples as they travel around Judea, I have to find a way, put those things in their right place. And what we need then is what's called a harmonization of the Gospels. Now, there are quite a few of those out there. They are many ways, they're in agreement. They don't all agree as to the time span. Some compress it, some extend it, but pretty much most agree it's 2.5 to 3 years of his ministry. And so we want to do that so that we can put all the events in order and follow him, and then fill in the gaps that some of the gospel writers leave. And just to give you one example, all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, okay, they jump from Jesus' baptism over about 6 to 10 months of his ministry in the startup year and go straight to his second year, beginning with his ministry at Nazareth, where he was almost stoned. And John is the one that fills us in on that. The synoptics don't often tell us what happened in Jerusalem. John is the one that fills us in on that. And Matthew might do some things, and Mark would do other things. And so we're going to try to put them all together. And we'll use that to give us a narrative. And then we're going to take those portions of that story that are unique to Luke. Didn't cover Mark. No, Mark didn't do it. Matthew didn't do it. They're unique to Luke, and we'll pull them down and try to draw our lessons from that. Now, there'll be a quiz on this next week, so make sure you master it. This is part of a harmonization of the Gospels. And it's one that is produced by Dr. F.C. Thompson in Thompson's Chain Reference Bible. How many of you have one of those? A few of you do. Yeah, very popular. Thompson has done what a lot of scholars have done, and he's tried to put these things together. Now, how do you do that? Well, there are places where two different gospel writers tell you of the same event, but one of them links that event to an event that the other gospel writers did. And so then you can put them in a chain. And so it takes a lot of effort. Believe me, I've tried doing a little bit of it myself, and you end up talking to yourself. But there are brilliant people who have done this, and this is pretty much a consensus view as to how Jesus went through his life. So we're going to just assume that Dr. Thompson got it right, okay? That he had it the way it really happened, and we're going to follow it just to use it as a framework. Now, let me explain what Thompson does is he gives us a list of events, of what Jesus taught, discourses, what he said, parables that he gave, and miracles. So these are all placed in order as best they can determine it from beginning to end. Now, this is not all of Jesus' life. There is what I call the prequel, which is his birth, John the Baptist's birth, and the prophecy, and the Magnificat, and all those good things, which we'll get into. And then after this, this goes from, this goes from the ministry of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus, comes all the way down here to the day that he stopped at Bethany to be anointed for his burial, and the next morning he went in for Palm Sunday. Now there's another column that gives you the Passion Week and then also the risen Christ, and we'll go in them. I just wanted you to get a feeling. This is the meat of his ministry, and this is kind of how we'd like to walk through it. So Thompson gives us this listing, and then he gives us these 4 columns. Now, if you have a Thompson Chain Reference Bible, the actual references are put in those columns. But if I put them in there, this would look really complicated. So I just said who covers it and put an X there. Anybody who wants a copy of that, by the way, if you don't have a Thompson Bible, just give me an email and I'll send it to you. I have a copy and send it to you in PDF. Now, you'll notice that these are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John. I've colored John a little bit differently because he's not one of the synoptics, and he's quite a bit different from the others. So that's what Thompson gave us in his harmonization. I've added the locations, okay? These are the locations, and they're color-coded. For example, green is Galilee, okay? Dark red is Jerusalem. And then you have orange, that's Samaria. Pink is Judea, that's the area around Jerusalem that Jerusalem's temple police controlled. Very important to know that. And then we have other places over here. So this tells you what happened, in what order it happened, and where it happened. Then what I've tried to do, just when you do this sort of stuff, it really helps you understand, is put down the miracles. See the blue squares with an M? Those are the miracles. And what's fascinating to me is that this miracle is the water made wine in Cana. And then he goes to Jerusalem, cleanses the temple, he preaches, he baptizes in Judea, and he and John the Baptist interact, and John the Baptist hands off to him, says he must increase, I must decrease. Remember that? And then John is arrested. And when he's arrested, Jesus leaves to go back to Galilee. Why do you think he left? Well, if the temple police arrested John for preaching and baptizing, that's what he was doing. It's time to leave. Very practical thing to do. But he doesn't go around Samaria. He goes right through it, and that's where he meets the woman at the well. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. And then he goes up to Galilee, and first thing you read about in Galilee is at Cana, and he does another miracle. And it says this is the second miracle he performed. They're kind of like bookend miracles over that first startup year. And you wonder, were there no miracles in Judea? Why not? What was he preaching? What was his message? And why weren't there any miracles? Well, we're going to talk about that a little bit when we get into that part. Okay. So the thing that, and a couple of things. The green squares with a P, those are parables. And what do you notice about the parables?
Bunched together.
They're all bunched together, right? They're bunched together in the narrative, and all where he is in Galilee. And it's interesting that, remember Jesus told parables, and he said, to those who have eyes to see and those who have ears to hear, you know. He's working in rural flyover country. Who lives in rural flyover country? Red state people. Red state people. These are people who are more devout, who believe in God, who want to follow Moses. They are what the Old Testament calls the righteous. They're disposed to hear from the Messiah when he comes. And so he goes to where the land is most fertile. And he says, and he does his parables, he teaches his parables in Galilee primarily. And then there's one other bunch, which is at the end of his ministry year, when it's really too hot for him to be in either Judea or Galilee or anywhere. He's across the Jordan in what's called Perea, okay, which is where he was baptized, by the way. And he spends a few months over there, and he gives a bunch of parables there. Once again, flyover country, red state, people who would be more inclined to hear what he had to say. In fact, there are very few parables, well, only two, given in Jerusalem when he was in the festival. And each one of those, you see the black square with the X? A black square means they tried to kill him, okay? If it either says they planned to kill him, they tried to kill him, they tried to seize him, they picked up stones to stone him. And there are some 8 occurrences. And if there's an X, he miraculously escaped. So the only time he told a parable in Jerusalem, he had to escape miraculously because they were out to stone him. Here again, down here, he's in Jerusalem, same thing. So you can get a lot from this. Okay, we're gonna use it as a tool. We won't look at the whole thing again very often, but we'll look at the parts of it that we care about, that we're talking about. But that doesn't tell you one thing. It doesn't tell you day to day. I mean, it tells me where he was, but how long was he there? What time of the year did he go there? Was he there for a week and he gave a whole bunch of parables, or was he there for 6 weeks and he did a lot of stuff? And the Bible doesn't tell us, and Thompson has no idea, he doesn't tell us either. But I've always said, when you study the Bible, what 2 things do you have to have? A map and a calculator, right? And so what you do is you take a look at where he was and you come up with a timeline. This is the chart for John Hines. He loves charts, and so I said, I got to give John a really good one. Okay, the timeline, just give you an idea. This number here is AD 27. That's on our Gregorian calendar. So I've normalized it to Gregorian calendar. And you got January through December of each year. So 27, 28, 29, 30. We know that John the Baptist began his ministry sometime in this year. It's the 14th year of Tiberius. Okay, and so we start from there, and then we anchor everything to the festivals. See these gray bars? That's Passover, March, April, right? And then over here, we have Tabernacles. That's in the fall. And then you have the Feast of Lights, which we call Hanukkah, celebrates the rededication of the temple after the Maccabees took it back. And that's in December, and Jesus went there. So we know if he was at the Festival of Lights, it was December, right? We know if he was at Passover, it was in the spring. So we can anchor those things. And then you say, how far did he have to travel? We'll figure 5 to 10 miles a day. You okay with that? He walks. If you're going day after day, you could probably do 5, maybe 10 miles. And he's not on a forced march. So that'll tell us how long it takes him to get someplace. And then you see how much stuff happened there and figure out best you can and see if you can hit your I call it hit your bogey when he goes to Jerusalem again, so that everything fits. All right, you get the idea of what I've done? And these boxes, they just give you the key elements. They come from over here. But for example, this is the first Passover. Over here, we have John baptizing Jesus in Perea, which is yellow. And then you have this gray, which is Jesus tempted in the desert. That's 40 days and nights. And he goes back to Perea. And that's where he's with John again. And then he calls 5 disciples. And then he makes his way back up to Cana, which is 75 miles away. So you follow this through, and it's just absolutely revealing, okay? And so now I realize that we're not going to be able to deal with the whole thing in one swell swoop, as they say, but we'll stay at altitude for a minute and look at some very interesting things that come out of this. You're looking at it from maybe 30,000 feet. And the first thing you know over here is how the synoptics agree with one another. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Do you see how they're all bunched together? You just look at that. And you see them up here, 3, 3, 3, 3 up here. And very often they're together with nothing over here on John's side. Okay. Same thing over here. They're all bunched together. So you see, the synoptics are telling very similar stories. And so we really believe that probably they had something in common that they were drawing from. Because Luke says at the beginning that lots of people have tried to put down what happened. And he said, I went ahead and started to really thoroughly investigate. Okay, but he had something to work with. Some scholars say that Matthew wrote a first draft of his gospel in Aramaic when the disciples were still in Jerusalem. So they would have been able to talk and go back and forth and so forth. And then about 40 AD, they all scattered, okay? About 10 years after Jesus was crucified. So I got a feeling that they're probably drawing from the same thing. But then John, he's the renegade. He is completely different. Look at John here. This is this whole 6 to 8 months that Jesus goes down for the first Passover, and he does all that initial preaching. And we'll see later, I think he's working with part-time disciples, not full-time at this point, okay? You can see him down here. The second Passover in Jerusalem is John. One of the things I just caught this today. If you look at the red, it's John that tells you what went on in Jerusalem. Here's Jerusalem here. That's John. John. The other guys don't tell you. Why? I think because John lived in Jerusalem a lot of that time. Okay, so he seems to have gone in there and said, look, I really like what you guys wrote, but I'm going to fill in some of the things that you missed. And that's what John seems to be doing. Okay, it's a different theme. He covers different things. Miracles. Well, we already talked about miracles, how they're bookended in Cana, and there's no miracles in Judea, and I'm not sure why. We'll have to talk about that later. And then the parables. The parables, John does not give you a single parable. There is no parable covered by the Apostle John. You know that? Gospel of John doesn't deal with it at all. Many discourses, sermons, so to speak, but no parables at all. And all the parables are given to us by the synoptics, okay? 8 attempts to seize him. I've only shown you 6 here because there's 2 more during Passion Week, all right? But you can see how many times they tried to seize him. And here's something very interesting. They picked up stones to stone Jesus, and he just walks through their midst and miraculously escapes. And they try to seize him in the temple, and he just walks away and then miraculously escapes. And this happens time and time and time again. I think that's why Judas did what he did. Because Judas had been embezzling, right? He'd been taking money out of the purse. He had to find a way to put that money back. And he thought, hey, I could do this easy. I'll go to these. Maybe he was talking to somebody from the temple. Say, hey, look, a little bit of money, I'm gonna grease my palm. I'll help you find him in a lonely place. If you want, you can go ahead and try and catch him. And so they said, well, how about 30 pieces of silver? He said, well, that'll about do it. I can put the money back in the purse and get a couple bucks for myself. And then Jesus will walk away and everything will be hunky-dory and nobody will be the wiser. I think that's what went on in Judas's mind. He's thinking, Jesus could escape from anything. And then that explains his enormous grief, his horror, when he saw that Jesus didn't escape, but they took him and they flogged him and they crucified him. And that's why he committed suicide. Isn't that fascinating? Yeah, I think that's it. You get that when you do this kind of a study. Now, here's another thing. When you look at this timeline, I want you to tell me, what do you see that's different between this timeline and this timeline?
Longer stretches of time.
Exactly. Up here, Jesus has not received a whole lot of opposition yet. In fact, the temple police who govern Judea leave him alone. He's got 2.5, maybe 3 months that he's preaching and baptizing in Judea, and he's really not bothered. And then when the temple police arrest John, he figures, well, let's see, I think it's time to go back to Galilee. And he goes through Samaria and up to Galilee. And he is in Galilee for a very long time. And he's preaching, healing, and nobody gives him any trouble. But here he comes down to Jerusalem for Passover, and we begin to see the opposition build. And he begins to draw in the opposition from the temple officials and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all those people. Then he goes back to Galilee, does the Sermon on the Mount. This is where he finally defines his apostles and calls the 12. It's been a long time that he hasn't had essentially the 12 together. But that happens here. And the opposition grows because they send the Pharisees and temple representatives up to Galilee to hassle him. And so the opposition begins. He crosses the lake to the Decapolis, and then he comes back, and the opposition bothers. So then he goes to a retreat on the eastern side of the Galilee lake in a city called Bethsaida. That's outside of the jurisdiction of Pilate. Okay, that's outside of the temple jurisdiction. And so he's going out there where he can operate. And they were going to have kind of a retreat, and 5,000 people follow him, and he feeds the 5,000. Well, you can't hide Jesus, right? So he walks on the water, he goes back to Galilee, and then he gives his discourse on the bread of life. And that's that discourse in John 6 where he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot see the kingdom. But you folks come to me because you got all that bread over there in Bethsaida. You liked having that bread for free. He said, but unless you eat this bread, because I am the bread of life. And what happened at that point?
A lot of them walk away.
A lot of them walked away. And what did Jesus ask the 12? You too? Yeah, are you going away too? And Peter gave that wonderful answer. Where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. Have you ever said that? When you're talking to the Lord, have you ever said, Lord, I haven't got a plan B. I'm in it. Jesus is my Lord. He is my Savior. He's got the words of eternal life. My hope's in him, nobody else. Got no place to go. So things start getting a little different right here when that happens. And so now the crowds are going down. They're not gone completely, but they're going down fast. And he's with the 12, and he takes them to a foreign country, to Phoenicia. Okay? And then they come down on the eastern side of the lake, in what's called the Hula Valley. It's a beautiful place. And they come down through Philip's Tetrarchy, and they go to they come down to Decapolis, and then they go back to where the Gadarene demoniac was healed, and 4,000 Gentiles are fed. Interesting. He's ministering to Gentiles. He comes back to Caesarea Philippi. That's way up to the north near Mount Hermon. So he's gone all the way up to Phoenicia, come back down to the Decapolis on the eastern side, and then go back up to Mount Hermon for the Transfiguration, and to the town of Caesarea Philippi, which, you remember that cave? The cave which is the gates of hell? That's up there. Okay? And then he comes back and sends out the 70, and they mock him and say, well, why aren't you going to the festival, Jesus? I mean, after all, you want a following, you ought to go where the people are. They were mocking him. That was his own brothers. And he said, it's not my time yet. And so you guys go. And they went. And then what happened? Jesus went secretly. He went on his own. Things have changed, haven't they? And you can see that he is moving around an awful lot more. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is he wants to steer clear of the temple police until his time has come. Secondly, I think he wants to get clear of most of the crowds and of the hassles and spend time with the 12, because it says from that time on, he began to tell them that he was to die, and he would be crucified, and he would rise again on the third day. So now he's pouring some personal time into his disciples. Okay, so then he goes to the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, and he winds up getting crosswise with the Pharisees again, and they try to kill him. And so he goes from Jerusalem across the river to Perea. Bright yellow is Perea again, outside of the temple police's jurisdiction. And he spends several months ministering there, but he gets a call. And the call says, your friend Lazarus is sick. And so he actually does a daring thing. He comes back to within 2 miles of Jerusalem, right? and he raises Lazarus from the dead. And everybody's just amazed and they're thrilled, except it says some people went to the Pharisees and told on him, and they came after him again. So he flees across it's hard to say Jesus flees anywhere. He just walks away from them and avoids them for another couple of months. And then he says, my time has come. He walks right across the river and he goes up to Bethany to be anointed for his burial. And he comes in on Palm Sunday, the King of the Jews. And then we have Passion Week, and then his appearances in Galilee. So that's the way this thing is laid out. And you can see a lot when you do that kind of a study. And it's absolutely fascinating. And we're going to use it as the backbone of our study. So now we're back in chapter 1, beginning with chapter 1, verse 5. It says, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah. I'll start right there. First of all, who in the world was Herod? And where did he come from? Was he a Jewish king? Was he a Roman? Well, let's take a look. A little history. You all know that you cannot put me up here and not get that chart, right? We always show that chart. For those of you who don't understand it, who haven't seen it before, I'll give you a real quick rundown. This is the chart of the Bible's history of the world. And if there's one thing, when I am gone, that I want the people that I've taught before to remember, is that history has a beginning and it has an end, and in the middle is the most significant event that ever happened. That's it. So I made it fairly easy. Divided it up in 500-year increments. Here you have the creation, of course, 1,600 years to the flood. We're not sure about the distance. I think about 1,000 years to Abraham, but we don't know. This is Abraham, 2000 BC. At 1500 BC, we have Moses. At 1000, we have, and then at 500, there is, the N always gets them, Nehemiah. Return from the exile, okay? Then you have the cross, and then you have Muhammad at 500, the Crusades at 1,000, the Reformation 1,500, and W is elected in 2000. Okay, what I've done is said, let's expand this thing from about 604 to about 100 AD, 604 BC to 100 AD, and down here is what you got, okay? And this tells you what happened to Israel. In that period, we frequently call the silent years, or at least some of them. 586, Babylon conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the city and the temple. Now, they had carried people captive from 604, where probably Daniel went. But nonetheless, 586 is the magic date that the city was torn down and the Temple of Solomon was destroyed. Well, then in 539, about 40 years later, Jews are living in Babylon in captivity. The Persians come in and they destroy Babylon and they conquer the Babylonian kingdom and they become the world empire. Now, do y'all remember that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream? And it was a giant figure. I think he thought it was himself. But it had several metals. The head was gold. The shoulders and arms were silver. And the belly was bronze. And the legs were iron, and then the feet and toes were iron mixed with clay. Except for the feet and toes, this is decreasing value, preciousness, and increasing strength. And he said, he interpreted it, said, these are the empires that will rule the world until Messiah comes. We are down there in the remnants of Rome with the steel and clay. That's one of the things, to me, he says we're in the last days. Okay, so about 539, Persia takes over, and immediately Cyrus says, you can go back, and a bunch go back under Zerubbabel, and they build the temple, and the temple, number 3, is completed. Now, the temple is completed in 516. The destruction of Jerusalem back here was in 586. Now, this is why you want the calculator. What's the difference between 586 and 516? 70 years. And Jeremiah prophesied that they would be in captivity for 70 years. Oh, there you go. All right, then we have Ezra and Nehemiah come back. The walls are complete. Now, all during this time, Persia dominates the world. And it's like almost 300 years. So that's a long time before Alexander the Great comes and he takes over. And then he controls, and his generals after him control the world, and it's very Greek, okay? Now, during that time, Israel was allowed to live in an area that was very small. That's it right here. See, this is the old kingdom of Judah that Babylon conquered. And before them, the kingdom of Israel, remember? So David's kingdom was both of these. So they're relatively small. And it was ruled as what's called a temple state. That is to say, they're allowed to have their religion. They can have their temple in the temple city, and they can rule the area around the temple city as long as they pay their taxes and don't revolt. And so this temple state was ruled by the priests. And the high priest became the most important person in Israel. Okay, and that's why Jesus was hauled before Caiaphas and his father-in-law, Annas. Okay, so, but the trouble was that stability didn't last. And when you get to about, 167 or so, then the Greek king, who needs some money, he sold the office of priest, high priest, to the highest bidder. And he comes in and he desecrates the temple. He offers a pig on the temple altar. And he forbids the Jews to have to practice their religion. And he tries to enforce on them a cult of worshiping the emperor. This causes them to rebel. That's the story of the Maccabees. Don't have a lot of time to talk about that. But for about 25 years before they gain their full independence, and then for about 80 more years, they rule Israel. And by war and politics and who knows what else, they actually extend their kingdom till it's that big. I didn't realize that. I hardly ever paid any attention to the sometimes called Hasmonean kingdom, the Maccabees. Only 80 years, but it got quite large, okay? Almost the size of Solomon's kingdom. That's interesting. Now, they were toppled in 63 and lost their independence to Rome. They were toppled by a civil war. Two sons of the queen wanted the kingdom, and they fought over it, and Rome came in and settled it. Okay, but how they settled it actually applies to what we're going to talk about. This is Idumea. Now, you're all familiar with Judea, right? Samaria, Galilee, we all got that down. Idumea, what is Idumea? Well, Idumea is an area that used to be the south of Israel. When Babylon carried the Jews off into captivity, their ancient enemies, descended from Esau, okay, brother of Jacob, moved in and they took over this part of the country. They grabbed it for themselves. For that, God was very, very angry with them. The prophet Obadiah speaks to this in Obadiah 1, verse 10.
Because of the violence against your brother Jacob, you will be covered with shame. You will be destroyed forever.
Okay, so when the Romans took control, it wasn't like they walked in one day and said, we've got it. It took years and years of struggle and war. And what delivered the kingdom to the Romans was an Idumean. All right, he was an official working for the Maccabees who turned on them, and with his son, whose name was Herod, delivered the kingdom to the Romans. All right, so that's where Herod comes into the picture. Now, Herod was ruthless. Part of his doing all this is he eliminated every single member of the Maccabean royal families, including his wife and several of his sons, whom he either exiled or murdered or convicted of treason and had executed. He was a pretty nasty guy. He had friends. He was good friends with Mark Antony. You've probably heard of him, Cleopatra's paramour, and Octavian, who became Caesar Augustus. He had good friends in high places. In fact, he spent several trips. He went back to Rome, and they gave him armies. They allowed him to come in, and he was ruthless as he took over. All right? So in return for all his fantastic service, Rome declared him king of Judea. And that's where we get this verse says, in the days of Herod, king of Judea. Not a Jew, okay? He's called Herod the Great. He's a Gentile, loved by Rome, hated by the Jews. And he hated them in return. He was murderous. He was corrupt, a Gentile. He was considered great. Doesn't that say something about the people that we call great? Yeah, what? Could be. Could be easy. I'm sure he called himself great. You know, I'm the greatest. I remember another guy like that. Okay, so he was a savvy politician. Like I say, he had friends in high places. He knew how to use them. Mark Antony and Octavius were his friends. But beside that, he also was an able administrator. If you read the story, because I've just skimmed over it, hardly giving you any detail. But if you read the full story, he was brilliant. He also was courageous. He was lucky, and he was just crazy. But he made it to the top. He climbed that greasy pole. And when he got there, he was an excellent administrator. He did whatever Rome needed. He kept the taxes flowing. He kept down the rebellion. He made it a peaceful place. And in fact, it prospered under his rule. Okay? So much so that the Romans kept throwing more territory at him. And that's where this territory up here comes from. And this is, you can call part of this Gaulonitis. That's where we get the name the Golan. Golan Heights. That's where the rockets are falling today in Israel, right up in this area right here. Mount Hermon's up here. Okay? And then he also got Perea, which is on the other side of the Jordan, and where Jesus spent some time there. Okay? So Herod has now got a kingdom that's larger than virtually anything that the kings of David's era ever had. And you're beginning to see the regions that the Bible talks about coming into focus. For example, you have Judea, right around Jerusalem, Samaria. That's where used to be the northern kingdom, and then a lot of foreigners moved in, and they're sort of tried to be like Jews, and they weren't Jews, and they were hated by the Jews, and you know how Samaria was, the Samaritans. And then you had Galilee, which was rural, beautiful country, if you've ever been there, and a lot of farms, and a lot of wonderful people up there. Then, of course, you had the Golan, the Gaulonitis, and Phoenicia, where Jesus went up north, and then, of course, Perea. So these are the regions now that come into focus. Besides being a good politician and a great administrator, he was an incredible builder, one of the greatest builders of the ancient world. Know what that is? Masada, yeah. He built 5 huge fortresses. Not far from Bethlehem was the Herodian. Way up on a hill, you could see it from Bethlehem, and all the lights up there. But then he also built down here on the Dead Sea, see it right here? Down at the Dead Sea, overlooking the Dead Sea is this thing called Masada. Very important to Jews. This is what they think it looked like in Herod's day. Okay, great view. I'm telling you, if you can get up there, it's a great view. And he also built several cities. But the most important one that he built was Caesarea, sometimes called Caesarea Maritima, which means Caesarea on the Mediterranean, to differentiate it from Caesarea Philippi, which is a different story. Okay, he built that. This is what that city looked like. It became his capital, and it had, Greek culture. They brought their theaters and Aristophanes and all the plays. The Romans brought the circus that had the chariot races. This was his palace. And just recently, the prison where Paul was held for 3 years is right there. And up here, they also built an artificial harbor. It became the principal harbor of Israel. And this is what it looks like today. You can go there today. There's still a lot of it left. There's the harbor. In fact, the warehouses are way over here. And they tell me when we're there that the water came all the way up to here. So it's much bigger than you see. So he built cities. But the most important thing that he built, his greatest project, was the temple. Now remember, Zerubbabel rebuilt the temple, right? They came out of captivity, and they went to Israel, and they had to rebuild the temple. And it was pitiful compared to Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was absolutely beautiful. But they kind of made it the pattern, and they rebuilt it, and they started the sacrifice, and God bless them, that was a good thing. But it's been 500 years, and it's getting kind of old. And so Herod made it his business to dramatically increase the temple. And he's the one that gave us this big retaining wall here, okay, these huge walls. and then a flat court up here, which we now call the Temple Mount. And I was just doing some research online. I saw Tim Mahoney is a filmmaker who has a site called Patterns of Evidence. I love his films. He's done a new one focusing on the temple with a 3D rendering company and some archaeological researches. And he tells you how he did it, what the design criteria were. Oh, I'm telling you, if you're interested in art and design, you must see this little film. I'm going to play just a tiny smidgen of it for you. Let's see, let's get the. All righty. There you go.
The Temple of Jerusalem that stood at the time of Jesus, rebuilt by Herod the Great, stands as one of history's greatest structures ever built, and the largest temple complex of the classical era. The Talmud declares that he who has not seen the Temple of Herod has never seen a beautiful building in his life. Jesus loved the temple, visiting often and teaching within its precincts. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed by the Romans, leaving only the foundations of this once magnificent structure. Every year in late summer, Jews around the world mourn the loss of the temple on what is now called Tisha B'Av.
Tisha B'Av was, last week, right? In fact, the Jews thought that Iran would attack on Tisha B'Av. That's when they mourned the loss of the first temple and the loss of the second temple, particularly the second temple. This is just a picture of the altar platform, and that's where the zealots held out at the very end when the Romans finally conquered the city. They broke through the walls, they made it to the temple, they got into the temple courts, and they fought it out on the altar. It's a dramatic scene, isn't it? Yeah. All right.
Herod's motivation for building that gorgeous, beautiful temple. He was not a believer. He was not Jewish. So why would he do that? Just to make it so popular?
Good question. He was a great Hellenizer. In other words, what was happening in Israel, and we're going to be into this pretty much in a minute, what was happening was Hellenization. In other words, the Greeks spread to the entire world their culture, and that included their architecture, their great buildings. We, to this day, love the Parthenon, right? The Pantheon, all kinds of temples and things that they built because they understood beautiful buildings. And this movie, by the way, tells you the ratios that they developed that we still use today. It's a remarkable thing. But it also added to his prestige. He was a great man. And so he knew that you'd have hundreds of thousands of people coming from all over the world for Passover and other festivals. Well, you know, he wanted to be the big man, and he was. He was very careful not to offend the religion of the Jews, although he was not a Jew. And he actually contributed buildings to some of the Jews in the diaspora, and they returned the favor by sending money to build the temple. Today, we send money to Israel from America, don't we? Yeah.
A lot of that predicted in the visions of Daniel. A lot of that was predicted in the visions of Daniel. He tells in more detail than we can understand.
Yeah, you're right. That's right.
That was also the Hellenization of Israel.
Yeah. Well, I liken it very much to the secularization and the, you might call it the wokeification of our own culture. You see this pressure coming upon us to change our fundamental heritage. And we'll get to that again in a minute. We're kind of inverting things here, but we'll talk about that again. This is the beginning of this harmonization that talks about everything prior to Jesus' ministry. That goes from when Gabriel appears to Zechariah all the way to Jesus' visit to the temple when he was 12, okay? Now, you notice how much yellow is there? That's almost all Luke. And it is a tribute to Luke's diligence and his attention to detail that we have these wonderful stories that we love of the prophecy of Zechariah's, of John the Baptist's birth, the Annunciation to Mary, the Magnificat, the Song of Zechariah, and we're going to look at those in detail. We wouldn't have them if it wasn't for him. Matthew gives us a little, but not much. He only gives us two real events. You have this event where the angel appears to Joseph in a dream and tells him, don't be afraid to take Mary to your wife, because he was thinking he's going to divorce this girl because she's having a baby outside of wedlock. And so Matthew tells us that. And then he tells us of the Magi who came maybe a couple years later, and while they were living in Bethlehem, and the fact that they had to escape to Egypt. And then the other Luke begins with Matthew when he returns to Nazareth. Okay, so most of this that we have, these wonderful stories, are from Luke. And I just imagine that when Luke was in prison here in Caesarea for 3 years, now remember, he had a team. I think we saw this last week. He had a team with over 9 evangelists, and they were sending them to Crete and to Cyprus and to Macedonia and Dalmatia. They would send them with letters, and so they were dealing with the churches. Paul's in the slammer. He's in Herod's prison in Caesarea. Now he gets a chance to speak to kings and to testify, but Luke's there to convey what they're doing, to get direction, to get letters, to get all kinds of work. But also, he spends all that time traveling from south to north, east to west, and visiting with all the people that were still alive. I think I mentioned Stephen Pressfield's book about the 67 war, the Six-Day War. He wanted to write it because the people were dying that lived through it. So he goes and he gets their testimony, and he just puts their testimony in the book. It's a wonderful book called The Lion's Gate. And that's kind of what Luke's doing. And I can just imagine Luke comes to the prison, and they buzz him through, and the door clangs behind him, and he sits down with Paul, and Paul says, before we get going to business, he says, tell me, what are you finding out? What have you found out? I managed to visit with Mary. She's 67 years old. And she remembers it all so well. And I wrote it all down. Let's craft this gospel together. And I talked to Mary and Martha, and they don't live in Bethany anymore. They're now living in Jerusalem. But I got a chance to talk to them. Lazarus, unfortunately, he's now gone. And Joseph, of course, is gone. And so I could just see the excitement as Luke gathers all this information and brings it in, and that gives us the book of Luke. Now, all these events and we're going to dig into them a little bit beginning next week, they take place in Herod's kingdom. And you have to remember, Herod was an Edomite opportunist who served Rome and oppressing the Jews. He murdered the entire serving royal family. He murdered his own children. Matter of fact, one Roman emperor said it's better to be Herod's dog than to be a member of his family. And then, of course, he murdered all the children in Bethlehem. And that's not really, you don't hear about that in the secular press and the secular accounts because it wasn't that unusual. He was that cruel and that wicked. And he pushed this process of Hellenization. I'm going to try to give you a little more insight into what Hellenization was next week. So it was a time of great, especially in Jerusalem, great apostasy, great corruption. The high priest was a position that was held up for auction, and you paid the Romans. If you had enough money, you got that job. And that's why the high priests were really members of the same small coterie of families that had all the money in Jerusalem. And of course, that's why the high priest was considered by people like the Essenes to be illegitimate. And that's why they left. They said, we had enough of this. This place is corrupt. Kind of, there's a lot of similarities, isn't there? The Greek philosophy, we had Jewish scholars like Philo saying they could find Plato's philosophy in the Old Testament. And so you spiritualize this and change that, and you can come up with a collaboration with Greek philosophy, with its religion, with its art. And of course, with all that came the licentiousness, because buried in Hellenization was license, sexual promiscuity, violence, and wickedness on a terrible scale. And I'll tell you next week why that was. But it came along with Hellenization, and it must have seemed to ordinary people that the ruling classes were seeking to destroy their heritage and pushing an alien and wicked culture on them. I want to say that again. It must have seemed to ordinary people that the ruling classes were seeking to destroy their heritage and pushing an alien and wicked culture onto them. Yeah. You say amen. Yeah, I agree. I can see a lot of similarities, can't you? Yeah. Yeah. But here's the good thing. In the hill country, and mostly in the country, there was a remnant of faithful, righteous Israelites. And the rest of that verse goes like this. In the time of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife, Elizabeth, was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. I want to give you, I forgot to trade that's Zechariah in the hill country. That's Nazareth, the Annunciation. She visits Elizabeth. They come down to Bethlehem. Baby's born, goes to Jerusalem, and they retreat to Egypt. Take those few words and put them back in history about 10 minutes.
Right. The reigning heads of the Pharisees would have dismissed Zechariah as a hill country preacher.
Right. The hill country preacher, absolutely right.
He was training in Jericho or Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you want to leave? There's two takeaways I want to leave with you. First of all, there is always a righteous remnant. There is always a righteous remnant. I don't care where you are. I had enough years at sea in the Navy with guys that were anything but religious, okay, where you'd think, well, you'll never find fellowship there. There was always one or two, three people to get together with, people who wanted to talk about the Lord Jesus, to study the Bible, to pray together, to sing. Sometimes they were ignorant. They didn't have a clue. Sometimes they were raging charismatics. They told me I was going to speak in tongues, and I didn't, unfortunately for them. I had a roommate who was a faith healer. And I said, well, how come I just got a cold? You know, but I loved them. They were great people. There's always a remnant. In 1 Kings, remember, Elijah, he's just come off of his big triumph on Mount Carmel, and fire fell from heaven, and all the prophets of Baal are slaughtered, and all the officials of the kingdom and the king are bowing down saying, Yahweh, he is God, Yahweh, he is God. And he runs before the king back to Jezreel, and he says, we're going to have a revival. The nation's going to turn back to the Lord. And what happens? Nothing happens. Instead, Jezebel puts a contract on his life, and he has to flee. And he goes into deep depression. And he goes all the way down to Sinai in Arabia, which is a long way. One of the most beautiful stories because of God's mercy and the way that he takes care of Elijah along the way, even feeds him, gives him bread and water. Angel fed him. And then he listens to his complaints. I've been a good prophet. I've done all the things. I've preached for you. I've carried your name all over Israel. And now they've gone ahead and slaughtered all your prophets. I'm the only one left. And what does God say to him? You're not. 1 Kings 19:18. Jack.
Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him.
There's always a remnant. Is there a remnant in America? I believe there is. We were having dinner at Toadvines once, and Bob and Judy Russell were there. And we were getting around the table, and after a while, we were talking a lot about how rotten things have got. You know, the world's falling apart, on fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're getting ready to leave, and Bob gets that twinkle in his eye. And he stands up and he says, well, God said that if he found 10 righteous in Sodom, he'd have saved the city. We got 8 right here. All we got to do is go out and find 2 more. Remember that? I love that guy. Yes, Jack.
Media would have us believe that there's a dearth of believers in America today, that, the denominations have all gone way down. There's not as many Christians. But in our ministry, we see these great groups of believers all over the country. We just had a group 2 weeks ago from Colorado. We hear all this bad stuff about Colorado. They live in a place called Woodland Park, Colorado. They've got a church there that's just going crazy. You will never see that in the media because it's not a mainline denomination. 90% of believers today, probably 100%, are outside the mainline denomination. So they don't, we don't get counted on anything in Southeast. There's 35,000 of us. There's about a month ago, we were in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, at a church that's blowing that town off of its foundation. And we see this all over the country where we go to do our leadership thing. And it's just the untold story of America where the media has suppressed and oppressed and suppressed anything about believers in Christ.
Yes. And so, when you pray for our country, I'm sure that, like me, you care about the country that our grandchildren will live in, right? And so when I pray for them, I say, Lord, we deserve your judgment. We richly deserve your judgment. But for the sake of the 10 righteous, of the remnant that's in America, spare your hand and instead send us a great awakening once again. Raise up righteous men to lead us. Deliver us from the wicked and let this country see another generation or two of faithfulness to you and return to the God of our fathers. I think that's how we ought to pray. I really do. There's always a righteous remnant. 2, God is always at work. He is always at work. Luke 2 begins, in the days of Caesar Augustus, there went forth a decree that all the world should be taxed. Here's this guy, has the mighty Roman legions all over the world. He has the right to tell everybody to get up and go wherever they were born and tell him how much money they made. He's powerful. And his henchman is Herod, who sits in the Herodian way up on that hill and parties night after night. He owns the country. Nobody dares do anything from him. And then down in Bethlehem, there's this little stable. And I love the Mark Harris song. It's my favorite Christmas song, if I can get through it. He has Joseph. The baby's been born, and he sort of comes out and stands outside the door, leaning up against the post, and maybe he's having a cigarette. I don't know. And he looks up at the sky, and maybe in the distance he looks at the Herodian. All its power, all of Rome's reach. And he puts these words in Joseph's mouth. He says, why me? I'm just a simple man of trade. Why her? She's just an ordinary girl. Why here? And in this stable filled with hay. Why him? With all the rulers in the world, look at him. He said, now he's scratching his head. He says, I won't second guess what angels seem to say. But this is such a strange way to save the world. And yes, it was. And I don't think they had a clue what was going on. But yes, it did save the world.